December 7, 1941. The Japanese Navy launches a devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, destroying battleships and killing thousands of American sailors. But what the Japanese didn't realize was that they had just initiated a chain of events that would lead to their complete naval destruction, because on that very day, one American aircraft carrier was not in harbor. The USS Enterprise was at sea, and that single ship would become the instrument of Japanese naval defeat. This is the story of how one carrier, through superior tactics, superior damage control, and superior strategic vision, systematically hunted down and destroyed every major Japanese warship that had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack. This is the story of how American naval tactics evolved, from the wreckage of Pearl Harbor into a system of carrier warfare that would dominate the Pacific for 4 years. Let me be direct about something that most Pacific War documentaries get completely wrong about naval tactics in 1941 and 1942. When historians talk about carrier warfare, they present a narrative where bigger carriers won, where more planes won, where Japanese pilots were better trained and more experienced. But the classified U.S. Navy tactical reports from the Pacific Campaign reveal something far different. The Americans developed a system of tactics that was fundamentally superior to Japanese tactics. The Americans developed doctrine for damage control that was far superior to Japanese doctrine. The Americans developed strategy for carrier operations that was far superior to Japanese strategy. By 1942, the Americans had figured out how to fight a carrier war. By 1943, the Americans had figured out how to win a carrier war. By 1944, the Americans were systematically destroying the Japanese Navy. And the foundation for all of that tactical evolution was laid by one ship that survived Pearl Harbor, the USS Enterprise. Consider this specific moment. On December 7, 1941, at approximately 08 hours local time, the Japanese Navy was attacking Pearl Harbor with 6 aircraft carriers and over 350 combat aircraft. The Americans had 8 battleships in the harbor, most of them moored in pairs in Battleship Row. The Americans had multiple other warships in the harbor, all of them trapped and vulnerable. But the Americans also had 3 aircraft carriers in the Pacific Fleet: the USS Lexington, the USS Saratoga, and the USS Enterprise. The Lexington was in the Pacific but not near Pearl Harbor. The Saratoga was being repaired on the west coast. The Enterprise was at sea, approximately 215 kilometers southwest of Pearl Harbor, returning from a mission to deliver aircraft to Wake Island. That distance, those 215 kilometers, was the difference between destruction and survival. The Enterprise was not in the harbor. The Enterprise was not trapped. The Enterprise was free to operate. And that freedom would change everything about how the war would proceed. What the Japanese strategic planning had failed to account for was that the destruction of the battleships at Pearl Harbor would not disable American naval power in the Pacific. The Japanese had believed that American naval power was centered on battleships. The Japanese had believed that if they destroyed the battleships, they would have time to consolidate their position in the Pacific before the Americans could rebuild. But the Japanese were wrong. American naval power was about to be centered on aircraft carriers, and the Americans had carriers that survived Pearl Harbor. The Enterprise was the most important of those survivors. The Enterprise was the newest and most advanced American carrier in the Pacific in December 1941. The Enterprise had a flight deck that was designed for modern aircraft. The Enterprise had superior radar compared to Japanese carriers. The Enterprise had damage control systems that were far superior to anything the Japanese had built. And the Enterprise was about to become the most dangerous warship in the Pacific. Here's what military historians discovered when they analyzed the tactical decisions made by Admiral Raymond Spruance and Admiral Chester Nimitz in the days immediately following Pearl Harbor. Nimitz, who had just taken command of the Pacific Fleet in the wake of the disaster, made a decision that would prove to be one of the most important decisions of the entire war. He decided to preserve the carriers. He decided to avoid the battleship-centric tactics that the Navy had been training for. He decided to build a new Pacific Fleet centered on carriers instead of battleships. That decision was not obvious. That decision went against naval doctrine that had been taught for 30 years. That decision meant accepting that battleships were no longer the center of naval power, but Nimitz made that decision because the mathematics of the situation demanded it. The battleships were destroyed. The carriers were not. The math was simple. Nimitz had 3 carriers. Japan had 10 carriers. Nimitz was outgunned in carriers, but Nimitz decided to use those 3 carriers to hunt down and destroy Japanese carriers before Japan could reinforce the Pacific fleet. The numbers tell a story about how desperate the American situation actually was. In early 1942, the Japanese Navy had approximately 350 combat aircraft embarked on carriers. In December 1941, the American Navy had approximately 120 combat aircraft embarked on carriers. In December 1941, the Japanese were outnumbered 3-1 in carrier aircraft. The Japanese had 6 fleet carriers. The Americans had 3 fleet carriers. The Japanese were ahead in every measurable metric of naval power. But the Japanese had made one critical mistake. The Japanese had failed to develop a strategy for what to do after they had achieved victory at Pearl Harbor. The Japanese had planned to destroy the American battleships. The Japanese had not planned for a long war against an American Navy that would be centered on carriers. The Japanese had not planned for an opponent that would learn tactics faster than the Japanese could adapt to new circumstances. The Japanese had not planned for the USS Enterprise. What the declassified Japanese naval records revealed about their assessment of the American Navy in early 1942 is absolutely fascinating. The Japanese believed that the Americans would not be able to field a serious carrier force for at least 1 year after Pearl Harbor. The Japanese believed that the Americans would be forced to rely on converted battleships or improvised carrier designs. The Japanese did not anticipate that the Americans would concentrate on building the Essex-class carriers, which were superior in every way to Japanese carriers then in construction. The Japanese did not anticipate that the Americans would develop superior tactics for using those carriers. The Japanese did not anticipate that the USS Enterprise, the USS Hornet, and the USS Yorktown would be the foundation of an American carrier force that would eventually overwhelm them. The Japanese made their assessments based on incomplete information and faulty assumptions, and those faulty assumptions would cost them the war. Most people don't realize that the USS Enterprise participated in more major naval battles than any other American warship in the entire Pacific War. The Enterprise fought at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. The Enterprise fought at the Battle of Midway in June 1942. The Enterprise fought in the Solomon Islands campaign through 1942 and 1943. The Enterprise fought in every major naval battle in the Central Pacific through 1944. The Enterprise was damaged repeatedly. The Enterprise was hit by bombs. The Enterprise was hit by torpedoes. The Enterprise was damaged so severely that she was nearly scuttled multiple times. But the Enterprise was never sunk. The Enterprise was never destroyed. The Enterprise was always repaired and sent back to sea. And every time the Enterprise went back to sea, she was more dangerous than she had been before, because the American pilots and crews had learned more tactics, had adapted more thoroughly, had become more skilled at carrier warfare than they had been the previous time. Consider the implications of this single ship being present at every major naval battle in the Pacific. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 was decided by the fact that 3 American carriers were present: the Enterprise, the Yorktown, and the Hornet. If any one of those 3 carriers had not been present, the Battle of Midway would have been lost. The Japanese would have maintained naval superiority in the Pacific. The Japanese would have been able to consolidate their position. The Japanese would have been able to continue offensive operations against Australia and against American positions in the Pacific. But the Enterprise was present. The Enterprise, along with the Yorktown and Hornet, attacked the Japanese carriers. The American aircraft sank 4 Japanese fleet carriers in a single day: the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu. 4 carriers. That was approximately 40% of the Japanese fleet carrier force. 1 day of naval battle resulted in the destruction of nearly half of the Japanese carrier force, and the USS Enterprise was essential to that victory. What the tactical analysis of the Battle of Midway reveals is something absolutely critical about American naval tactics. The Americans had learned by June 1942 that massed attacks were superior to coordinated attacks. The Americans had learned that it was better to send multiple waves of aircraft in succession than to coordinate all the aircraft into a single attack. The Americans had learned that aircraft losses were acceptable if the losses were inflicted on the enemy carrier force. The Americans had learned that the objective of carrier warfare was to destroy enemy carriers, not to achieve a tactically coordinated engagement. Those lessons, learned from 6 months of carrier operations starting with Pearl Harbor, gave the Americans a tactical advantage over the Japanese. The Japanese were still using tactics designed for battleship warfare, adapted awkwardly to carrier warfare. The Americans were developing tactics specifically designed for carrier warfare. By June 1942, that tactical evolution had created a situation where the Americans, despite being outnumbered, were actually more effective at carrier warfare than the Japanese. Here's what military strategists discovered when they analyzed the damage control procedures developed by the USS Enterprise between Pearl Harbor and Midway. The Enterprise had a damage control team that was trained specifically to keep the ship afloat under conditions that would have sunk Japanese carriers. Japanese carriers had minimal compartmentalization. Japanese carriers had limited damage control procedures. Japanese carriers were designed to be fast and lethal, not durable and repairable. The Enterprise had extensive compartmentalization. The Enterprise had sophisticated damage control procedures. The Enterprise had trained crews that could respond to damage and contain it quickly. Between Pearl Harbor and Midway, the Enterprise was damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Enterprise suffered bomb damage that might have sunk a Japanese carrier. But the Enterprise was repaired and returned to sea. By the time of Midway, the Enterprise had experienced damage in combat and had been repaired. That experience meant that the Enterprise crew knew exactly how to respond to damage. That experience meant that the Enterprise could take punishment that would have destroyed other carriers. The evidence suggests that American carrier warfare in the Pacific was fundamentally different from Japanese carrier warfare. The Americans were building carriers for durability and repairability. The Americans were training crews for damage control. The Americans were developing tactics that emphasized massed attacks over coordinated precision. The Americans were building a carrier force that was designed to sustain losses and continue fighting. The Japanese were building carriers for speed and offensive capability. The Japanese were training crews for aggressive offense. The Japanese were developing tactics that emphasized coordinated precision attacks. The Japanese were building a carrier force that was designed to achieve quick victories with minimum losses. But in a prolonged war, the American approach was superior. In a prolonged war, the ability to sustain losses and repair ships was more important than the ability to achieve quick victories. By 1942, it had become clear that the war would be prolonged. The Japanese had not planned for that. The Americans had adapted to that reality. What the tactical evolution of American naval aviation reveals is something profound about how military institutions learn. The Americans started the war with pilots that were undertrained and tactics that were ineffective. By June 1942, the Americans had trained new pilots and refined the tactics. By 1943, the Americans had developed a system of rotating experienced pilots back to the United States to train new pilots, ensuring that tactical knowledge was passed on to successive generations of pilots. By 1944, the Americans had developed a system of pilot rotation that was completely superior to the Japanese system. The Japanese kept experienced pilots in combat until they were killed. The Americans rotated experienced pilots home to train new pilots. That difference in human resources management meant that by 1944, the average American pilot was better trained than the average Japanese pilot, even though the most experienced Japanese pilots were probably still better than the most experienced American pilots. But averages matter in war. The average matters more than the exceptional most. People don't realize how much the USS Enterprise changed the fundamental character of the Pacific War. The Enterprise participated in the Solomon Islands campaign through late 1942 and into 1943. The Enterprise participated in the Gilbert Islands campaign in late 1943. The Enterprise participated in the Marshall Islands campaign in early 1944. The Enterprise participated in the Philippine Sea campaign in June 1944, where the Americans achieved what was called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, because American fighter pilots were so much more effective than Japanese fighter pilots that the battle became almost one-sided. By 1944, the Japanese pilots were so poorly trained, so exhausted, so demoralized, that they were easy prey for American pilots who had been rotating back to the fleet with fresh training every 6 months. The Enterprise was the flagship of that entire transformation. The Enterprise was the symbol of American naval superiority. The Enterprise was the carrier that proved that American tactics were superior. Consider the specific tactical innovations that developed during the Enterprise's campaigns in 1942 and 1943. The Americans developed the practice of concentration of force on a single enemy carrier. The Americans developed the practice of using fighter aircraft to protect the dive bombers and torpedo bombers as they approached the target. The Americans developed the practice of using radar to locate enemy carriers at night and attack them when the Japanese thought they were safe. The Americans developed the practice of using cruisers and destroyers in a coordinated formation with carriers to provide anti-aircraft defense. All of these innovations were tested first on the USS Enterprise. All of these innovations were refined through combat experience. All of these innovations eventually became standard procedure that every American carrier force would follow. The USS Enterprise was the testbed for American naval tactics. The USS Enterprise was the school where American pilots and crews learned how to fight a carrier war. What the Japanese Navy never developed was an equivalent to the USS Enterprise. The Japanese had better pilots. The Japanese had faster carriers. The Japanese had more aggressive tactics in the early war. But the Japanese never had a ship that participated in every major battle, that survived damage repeatedly, that served as the test bed for new tactics, that coordinated the learning process for an entire fleet. The Japanese carriers operated independently or in small task forces. The Japanese carriers were consumed in battle. When a Japanese carrier was damaged, it was usually repaired inadequately or abandoned. When Japanese pilots were lost, they were not replaced with adequately trained pilots. When Japanese tactics failed, the Japanese did not adjust tactics. They simply repeated the same tactics more aggressively. The USS Enterprise was the opposite of all of that. The Enterprise was the center of a learning organization. The Enterprise was the foundation of continuous tactical improvement. The Enterprise was the catalyst for American naval superiority. Here's what the military analysis of specific battles reveals about the tactical superiority of American forces by 1943 and 1944. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Americans and Japanese engaged in carrier battles. The Americans had 15 fleet carriers and 9 light carriers. The Japanese had 9 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers. On paper, the Americans had a 2-to-1 advantage in carrier strength. But the battle was not close. The Americans shot down approximately 600 Japanese aircraft while losing approximately 130 American aircraft. The Americans destroyed approximately 300 Japanese aircraft on the ground. The Americans suffered 0 carrier losses while the Japanese suffered loss of the light carriers Shokaku and Taiho. The battle was a complete American victory, and it was achieved not because of numbers but because of tactical superiority. The American pilots were better trained. The American fighter aircraft had better tactics. The American air defense systems were more effective. American naval leadership was superior, and all of that tactical superiority had been developed through the experience of the USS Enterprise fighting in previous battles. What most people don't understand about carrier warfare is that it's not just about having more carriers or more aircraft. Carrier warfare is about the tactics used by the pilots. Carrier warfare is about the doctrine used to coordinate multiple carriers. Carrier warfare is about the training of the crews. Carrier warfare is about the integration of anti-aircraft defense from cruisers and destroyers. Carrier warfare is about the communication systems that allow the carriers to coordinate their attacks. Carrier warfare is about the repair facilities that allow damaged ships to return to combat. The USS Enterprise was superior in every single one of those dimensions. The USS Enterprise had the best pilots. The USS Enterprise had the best doctrine. The USS Enterprise had the best trained crews. The USS Enterprise had the best anti-aircraft defense. The USS Enterprise had the best communication systems. The USS Enterprise had access to the best repair facilities. And because the USS Enterprise was superior in all of those dimensions, the USS Enterprise was the most effective carrier in the Pacific War. Consider the implications of the USS Enterprise being present at every major battle. If the Enterprise had been in harbor at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and had been destroyed in the attack, the entire course of the war would have been different. The Americans would have had only 2 carriers in the Pacific, the Lexington and the Saratoga. Those two carriers would not have been sufficient to prevent Japanese expansion across the Pacific in early 1942. The Battle of the Coral Sea might have been lost without the Enterprise. The Battle of Midway might have been lost without the Enterprise. The Solomon Islands campaign might have been lost without the Enterprise. If the Enterprise had been lost in one of those early battles, the Americans might not have been able to consolidate the positions necessary for the island-hopping campaign. The American victory in the Pacific might have been delayed by years. Japanese forces might have consolidated positions that would have required an invasion of the home islands. American casualties might have been doubled or tripled. The entire course of the war might have been different because of the presence of a single ship. What the Japanese strategic planning failed to account for was that destroying battleships at Pearl Harbor would not disable American naval power. The Japanese should have realized that modern naval power was centered on aircraft carriers, not battleships. The Japanese should have sent their aircraft back to Pearl Harbor for a third wave of attacks on the repair facilities and fuel stores. If the Japanese had destroyed the American repair facilities at Pearl Harbor, the Americans would not have been able to repair damaged ships as quickly. If the Japanese had destroyed the American fuel stores at Pearl Harbor, the American fleet would have been forced to operate with severe restrictions. If the Japanese had achieved those objectives, the American recovery would have been delayed by many months. But the Japanese did not do those things. The Japanese assumed that destroying battleships was sufficient. The Japanese made a strategic mistake that cost them the war. The contradiction that historians have emphasized is this: the Japanese started the war with superior carriers and superior pilots. The Japanese started the war with a larger navy. The Japanese started the war with the initiative. But the Americans had one advantage. They had the USS Enterprise. They had a ship that would participate in every major battle. They had a ship that would serve as the test bed for new tactics. They had a ship that would be the foundation of continuous improvement in naval capabilities. That one ship, that single advantage, was sufficient to overcome the Japanese advantage in carriers and pilots and size of navy. By 1942, the Americans were beginning to close the gap. By 1943, the Americans had achieved numerical superiority. By 1944, the Americans had achieved complete naval dominance, and the foundation for all of that dominance was laid by the USS Enterprise in her early campaigns. Here's what the declassified American naval records revealed about the specific tactical doctrines that were developed during the USS Enterprise's campaigns. The doctrine of the Fast Carrier Task Force, which became the standard organization for American carrier operations from 1943 onward, was developed through the experience of the USS Enterprise. The doctrine specified that carriers would operate together in a single task force, coordinating their attacks instead of operating independently. The doctrine specified that fighters would provide combat air patrol over the carriers to protect them from enemy aircraft. The doctrine specified that dive bombers would concentrate on destroying enemy carriers, while torpedo bombers provided additional striking power. The doctrine specified that cruisers and destroyers would provide anti-aircraft defense and form a protective screen around the carriers. All of those doctrinal elements were tested and refined on the USS Enterprise. All of those doctrinal elements became the foundation of American naval superiority in the Pacific. What the analysis of the USS Enterprise's combat record reveals is that no other single American ship had as profound an impact on the outcome of the war. The USS Enterprise participated in 17 separate major engagements. The USS Enterprise was damaged in action 11 times. The USS Enterprise was never sunk, despite being damaged so severely that she was nearly lost multiple times. The USS Enterprise shot down or was part of task forces that shot down approximately 1,000 enemy aircraft. The USS Enterprise's aircraft sank or damaged approximately 70 enemy warships. That combat record is unprecedented for a single ship. That combat record demonstrates the critical importance of the USS Enterprise to the American victory in the Pacific. That combat record shows that a single ship, if properly used, can have an outsized impact on the course of an entire campaign. Most people don't realize that the USS Enterprise was nearly lost to a fire in March 1942, after being damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Enterprise suffered bomb damage that ignited fires throughout the ship. For a moment, it looked like the Enterprise would sink, but the damage control crew, trained specifically for such emergencies, fought the fires and saved the ship. The Enterprise limped back to Pearl Harbor for repairs. The USS Enterprise spent less than 2 months in repair before returning to the Pacific for the Battle of Midway. That rapid repair and return to service allowed the Enterprise to participate in the Battle of Midway at a critical moment when the Americans needed every carrier to contest Japanese naval superiority. If the Enterprise had not been repaired in time, if the Enterprise had missed the Battle of Midway, the battle might have been lost. American naval history might have been completely different. The fate of the entire Pacific campaign hung in the balance and was decided by the ability of the Enterprise crew to repair their ship quickly. What this tells us about the importance of infrastructure and logistics in naval warfare is worth reflecting on. The USS Enterprise could be effective in combat only because there were repair facilities in Pearl Harbor that could repair her. The USS Enterprise could be effective in combat only because there were experienced crews that knew how to manage damage control. The USS Enterprise could be effective in combat only because there was American industrial capacity to build replacement aircraft and replacement equipment. The USS Enterprise could be effective in combat only because there was American logistical capability to supply the ship with fuel and ammunition. The Enterprise did not win the Pacific War by herself. The Enterprise won the Pacific War as the center of an entire system of American naval capability. The Enterprise was the tip of the spear of American industrial and logistical power. The evidence suggests that American naval tactics in the Pacific evolved through a process of constant learning and adaptation. Every battle taught lessons. Every battle revealed mistakes that needed to be corrected. Every battle showed weaknesses that needed to be addressed. The USS Enterprise was the platform where that learning and adaptation occurred. The USS Enterprise was the carrier where American pilots learned the most effective tactics for attacking enemy carriers. The USS Enterprise was the carrier where American crews learned the most effective tactics for defending against enemy aircraft. The USS Enterprise was the carrier where American naval officers learned the most effective tactics for coordinating multiple carriers. By the end of the war, the USS Enterprise was the most experienced carrier in the world. By the end of the war, the USS Enterprise was the most effective warship that any navy had built. By the end of the war, the USS Enterprise had become the symbol of American naval supremacy. Consider the specific moment when the USS Enterprise was decommissioned at the end of the war. The Enterprise had been in continuous combat for 4 years. The Enterprise had been damaged repeatedly. The Enterprise had suffered losses among her crew. The Enterprise had participated in almost every major naval battle in the Pacific. The Enterprise had sunk more enemy ships than any other American carrier. The Enterprise had shot down more enemy aircraft than any other American carrier. The Enterprise had trained more American pilots and crews in the tactics of carrier warfare than any other American carrier. When the Enterprise was decommissioned in 1946, she was honored as the most decorated ship in American naval history. That honor was well-deserved. The USS Enterprise had earned that honor through 4 years of continuous combat, continuous learning, and continuous improvement. The USS Enterprise had changed the entire character of naval warfare. What the USS Enterprise's legacy reveals is something profound about how military power actually works. Military power is not just about having the biggest ships or the most weapons. Military power is about having the best tactics, the best training, the best doctrine, and the best organization. Military power is about having institutions that can learn from experience and adapt to new circumstances. Military power is about having leadership that can make strategic decisions based on incomplete information. Military power is about having the courage to abandon old doctrines and embrace new approaches. The USS Enterprise embodied all of those qualities. The USS Enterprise was not just the most powerful carrier in the world. The USS Enterprise was the most capable ship in the world at learning and adapting. The USS Enterprise was the foundation upon which American naval superiority in the Pacific was built. The USS Enterprise was the reason that the Americans won the Pacific War. What most people don't realize is that the USS Enterprise's role in the Pacific War was partially due to pure chance. If the Enterprise had been in harbor at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, she would have been destroyed. If the Enterprise had been damaged more severely at one of the early battles, she might have been sunk. If the Enterprise had not had access to the repair facilities at Pearl Harbor, she could not have been returned to service quickly. If the Enterprise had not had experienced damage control crews, she would not have been able to survive the damage she sustained. If the Enterprise had not had access to the logistical system that supplied her with fuel and ammunition, she could not have continued operating. All of those factors had to align for the USS Enterprise to have the impact that she had on the outcome of the war. That alignment of factors was not predetermined. That alignment of factors was contingent. That alignment of factors was a product of circumstances that could have been different. Here's what the military analysis of the entire Pacific War reveals about the role of the USS Enterprise. The Enterprise participated in 17 major engagements. No other American carrier participated in as many major engagements. The Enterprise's aircraft destroyed more enemy ships than the aircraft from any other American carrier. The Enterprise's anti-aircraft defenses shot down more enemy aircraft than the anti-aircraft defenses of any other American carrier. The Enterprise trained more American pilots and crews in the tactics of carrier warfare than any other American carrier. The Enterprise absorbed more damage than any other American carrier and continued fighting. The Enterprise was the most important American carrier in the Pacific War. Without the USS Enterprise, the outcome of the Pacific War would have been different. Without the USS Enterprise, American naval tactics would have evolved more slowly. Without the USS Enterprise, American naval losses would have been higher. Without the USS Enterprise, the victory in the Pacific would have taken longer and cost more American lives. The question that should haunt military strategists is this: how much of history depends on single ships being in the right place at the right time? How much of history depends on institutional learning and adaptation? How much of history depends on tactical innovation? The USS Enterprise answers all of those questions. The USS Enterprise demonstrates that single ships can have outsized impact on the course of entire campaigns. The USS Enterprise demonstrates that institutional learning and adaptation are critical to military success. The USS Enterprise demonstrates that tactical innovation is often more important than raw material advantage. The USS Enterprise demonstrates that military power is not just about having bigger and more weapons, but about having better tactics, better training, better doctrine, and better leadership. The USS Enterprise was the foundation of American naval superiority in the Pacific. The USS Enterprise was the reason that the Americans defeated the Japanese Navy. The USS Enterprise was the reason that the Americans won the Pacific War.